Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olga Atamanova, and I'm happy to see you in Media Center, Ukraine, Ukrinform. It's year 9 of the war, and almost 9 years ago, it started with the occupation of Crimea. That was the very moment when the war for our identity of our children started. From the very first days of occupation. Russia uses education as the powerful tool to fight our Ukrainian identity, and this is why we gathered here today. Our colleagues want to present the analytical summary how Russia destroys the identity of children in the occupied Crimea. I want to introduce our speakers. It's Anastasia Vorobyova, analyst at Almenda Center for Civic Education. Are you with us, Miss Anastasia? Joining us here in this studio is Maria Sulyalina, project manager at Almenda Center for Civic Education, and Andrii Shchekun, representative of the Regional Council of Ukrainians in Crimea, coordinator of Humanitarian Policy Group of Crimean Platform Expert Network. Miss Anastasia, let's probably start with you. I would like to ask you to start with the presentation of the analytical report. Please. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Anastasia Vorobyova. I'm an analyst and I'm the author of this report, Crimean Scenario, the destruction of Ukrainian education. And I want to present you the result of the joint work, the gathered information of how the Ukrainian education was destroyed back in from the time of 2014, the infringement by Russian Federation and the crimes committed by them in the occupied territories of Ukraine in the context of destruction of Ukrainian education. I'm sharing the presentation with you right now. Are you seeing the presentation? Yes, we've seen it on the screen. All right. What are we going to talk about today? First of all, the Crimean scenario of destruction of education, implementation of Crimean scenario on occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. And we will tell you in brief about how the full-scale invasion influenced the education in Crimea, and in the end we will present the qualification of the actions of Russian Federation, specifically why those actions should be called indoctrination and cultural genocide and attempts to eradicate Ukrainian identity in the occupied territories. Why Crimean scenario? First of all, we didn't want in our report to make an erroneous impression that the war started in 2022. Occupation of Ukrainian territories is going on since 2014, and in Crimea, since the beginning of occupation, the administration of Russia, well, de facto administration of Russian Federation, started systemic actions in eradication Ukrainian identity. And those actions were aimed at Crimean children specifically. This is why structurally we divided the report in a number of parts. In the first part we tell about the school education in the occupied territories. We tell about what was going on in Crimea since 2014, and then we compare those actions with the actions of Russian Federation in the newly occupied territories, so to say, in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. And here we see that there are a lot of parallels. And as administration of Russian Federation in 2014 in Crimea, in the same way in 2022 in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, they are very similar, and they include a number of equal elements that we consider as a Crimean scenario. Then we we tell how in 2022 the militarization was reinforced in occupied Crimea, how this de facto war of Russia against Ukraine, or so-called special operation, how it affected the education of Ukrainian children in occupied Crimea. That was justification of aggression, the reinforcement of engagement of children into militaristic actions, and their recruitment to the armed forces of Russian Federation. And in the end, we summarize it and we explain why such actions of Russian Federation fall under the prohibition of indoctrination in the international law, and why eradication of identity in the international law is also prohibited by the international law. What Crimean Scenario includes its full transition to the Russian standards of education, and Russian occupational administration since 2014 stated in summer that Crimean schools will be fully transferred to Russian education program. It means the replacement of study materials to the Russian ones. There are only Russian study books in Crimea since 2014. They were replaced immediately. Then it's retraining and replacement of the teachers to those loyal to the new authorities. Since the beginning of occupation, the de facto administrations tried to form the loyal backbone of the teachers who agreed, who consented to work with the new administration. They were sent for a training to Russian Federation, and they keep engaging teachers from Russian Federation who come to temporarily occupied Crimea to teach in the Crimean schools. It's the absence of the Ukrainian cycle subjects such as history of Ukraine or Ukrainian language. Is the restriction of opportunities to study Ukrainian language. Ukrainian language is not studied in Crimea at this moment, and moreover, the occupational administrations try to spread the narrative to make Crimean children associate Ukrainian language with the enemy language, which creates additional obstacles for Crimean children to enter Ukrainian educational institutions, higher educational institutions. Also, it's a militarization of education process, such as creation of cadet classes under patronage of Russian government agencies, and implementation of Russian youth movements of the patriotic type, and a number of different patriotic organizations like Big Change, the movement of the first ones, which are additional instrument of influence on the conscience of Ukrainian children in Crimea. Regarding the occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, Russian Federation started acting according to the scenario they implemented in Crimea in 2014, and they immediately announced the transition to the Russian education standard and Russian language in education. As to the Russian language in education, we found information that there were even the Russian teachers coming from Russian Federation to the territory, to occupied territories of Ukraine, to prepare the children to study in Russian language. Is the replacement of Ukrainian study books, the active persuasion of the teachers to collaboration with occupational authorities, and those who were persuaded, they were sent for a training to Crimea and even to Russian Federation. Engagement of children and youth to patriotic movements in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. There are already youth army and young South movements. There is also militarization of the education process in 2022. There were news about the implementation of cadet classes in Kherson region starting from 2023 under the patronage of enforcement agencies of Russian Federation, law enforcement agencies of Russian Federation. This is what we can say about the territories which were occupied since 2023, but the so-called special military operation influenced the education in Crimea as well. First of all, specifically with the since 24 February 2022, the Crimean children were actively engaged in the actions for support of the war of Russia against Ukraine, against so-called the special military operation, and the war of Russia against Crimea is demonstrated to the children of Crimea as a liberation war against so-called fascist state. And they create the perception of Ukraine as an enemy state which should be protected from with the arms in their hands. It's an example of use of the so-called special military operation as the militarization instrument through heroization of the participants of the war against Ukraine, the lessons of resilience, opening of memorial boards to honor the so-called heroes of the special military operations, the parks of heroes in the schools, and the reinforcement of propaganda of military service in the armed forces of Russian Federation. We should also note the implementation of the weekly classes, which they call the conversations about the important, which plant the the so-called right ideology, the planting of proper values, and like military service in the armed forces of Russian Federation. And it's worth mentioning that both in Crimea and in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, their occupied parts, the Russian understanding of patriotism is being implemented. Love to Russian Federation is integral with military duty. Without military service with the Russian armed forces, you cannot be considered a patriot of Russian Federation. And through this very narrative, Ukrainian children are being indoctrinated, they are being ideologically processed to educate the patriots of Russian Federation who would wish to serve with the Russian armed forces. And proceeding to the final part of the report, where we assess such actions, it's worth to mention that eradication of Ukrainian identity is not an innovation since 2014. Back in the times of Soviet Union, they tried to eradicate Ukrainian identity through eradication of Ukrainian literature, religion, and this is exactly what's going on in the territories occupied by Russian Federation today. So this is why we've picked the term indoctrination as planting of specific ideology, and we see that this is what's going on in the occupied territories since 2014. I think I will wrap it up. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any question, and it would be my pleasure to pass the microphone to my colleagues. Andrii, Maria, let's summarize what we've heard. We've understood that the militarization of our children is underway, that Russians consequently and consistently use education as a tool for ideological influence, and it's been going on for 9 years. What should we do about this, and what does it tell us? Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the team of Almenda. It's quite a professional team. Since 2014, they study the education field and all the processes of monitoring, analysis, and publicity. This is what we have. Thanks to this team, we have the real data. We have opportunities to counter the Russian propaganda and indoctrination, and thanks to such civil activists, we have to think that after the occupation, we should not leave it unpunished, and all those people who were committing those anti-humanistic illegal actions, they should be brought to liability. I would also like to mention years 2014-2017 when we, together with Almenda, the Crimean group for protection of human rights, we were monitoring the eradication of Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian kindergartens, Ukrainian classes. Back in that period, we were gathering the information, risking with our activists who were in occupied Crimea back then, because it was them who were doing the information, were submitting information requests in the occupied Crimea. They were submitting them to occupational powers who worked in favor of Russian Federation, and based on the information we provided, there was a decision undertaken by the United Nations as to the renewal of classes and schools with Ukrainian language and the language of study. It was the first signal of the legal nature for Russia to ponder over what they were doing, but they kept on eradicating everything Ukrainian, and it was said correctly today that there's nothing Ukrainian left in the education area at all. But where are the Ukrainians gone? Then there is a question arising. So if you pay attention to the population census, in year 2014, 10% of the Ukrainian population just disappeared from Crimea, and according to this year's census, or last year's census, the population of Ukrainians was amounting to 7% in Crimea, which says about the lingua side and the ethnos side of Ukrainians in Crimea, because it's the goal of Russian Federation to eradicate Ukrainian identity and to get them assimilated, to make the discriminated Ukrainians to become Russians, so to say. And this is the process which is executed through the education, and many activists who were remaining in Crimea, they were understanding that in the field of education there are no possibilities to protect their interests. They were creating different civil institutions. They didn't have any legal component like Ukrainian Unity, like a Ukrainian Cultural Center, which was working in Simferopol, for example, since 2014. Yesterday, Galina Balaban, one of the activists, was detained. And in fact, today, aggressor eradicates Ukrainian identity. They switch from culture, from education. They switch to violent actions against activists. And it includes Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has been eradicated in Crimea. We know about the challenges we're facing today in terms of religion and religious education, and today is good that there is understanding by the government officials of those facts. Yesterday last year we had a press conference with Taras Kremeny, the Commissioner for Protection of Ukrainian Language. We were raising questions about the state identity, state
Ukrainian culture, and in our conclusions we have the same opinion that it's a linguocide going on in Crimea, the killing of Ukrainian language. As a network, as the civil platform, we try to communicate to both government and our international partners that our studies, the reports, so we communicate with UNESCO, the representatives on the education matters. It's being done on an annual basis, and we are ready to actualize that issue in front of the government agencies. There should be new facts investigated, the new criminal proceedings initiated, because there are people behind all those decisions. They're not taken by themselves. Those Russian narratives, they just don't happen out of nowhere. There are people behind them which should be identified, their names and last names, their acts should be documented and submitted to the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, so that after the occupation we could easily find them and they could be brought to liability in compliance with the law of Ukraine in effect. Once again, I want to thank the team of Almenda, and as the Crimean expert group, Crimean expert platform, we are ready to get involved in your activities and to inform the civil society about all the actions we undertake and to divulge our reports. Ms. Maria, good morning. I want to thank that what we're talking about today is the complex policy of Russian Federation, which they implement against the most vulnerable category, the children, who due to their age they cannot counter their propaganda, and they perceive easier those narratives that Russia imposes, and those narratives are being spread through formal education, through study books, through practical recommendations, special classes, and through informal education, through the network of classes, youth organizations. And their role and importance is that in the newly occupied territories there are already departments of cadet classes, youth army, and other youth movements which will consistently eradicate Ukrainian identity in our children. And the opportunity to deploy such network to work to implement such scenario in the newly occupied territories, such opportunity emerged because Russia was experiencing impunity. They knew that education is not being discussed in international platform. It's not a priority. There are no sanctions for what Russia does in education. What they do with children's identity only is being documented after years. And this story of such facts being documented after years, it resulted in the children who became the victims of such propaganda in the occupied territories, and we don't have physical access to those children. And now we have to start reflecting on what to do with those children after we deoccupy our lands. Such children, they became the hostages, the victims of such propaganda. We did not preserve the ties with them, and after the occupations we have to have the programs developed now, how to fight those narratives, how to reintegrate those children in our society, because if we treat them as our enemies, Russia wins. Russia made them their citizens if Ukraine refuses them. So it's important for Ukraine to send a message to those children, to say that they are our citizens. We will support you. We will assist you to become a part of Ukrainian society. And Ukraine made some steps in that direction. There's the facilitation of entering to the higher educational institutions for children from occupied territories, and the remote education. Well, but we cannot do everything by ourselves. Important is the participation of international community, who only started paying attention to the education matters after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when youth army was deployed in the occupied territories, when they added the Minister of Education of Russian Federation onto the sanction list, when they were opening the Russian educational institutions in the newly occupied territories. And it's only now that the international community opened their eyes and reacted properly. But should they have done it back in 2014, the things like today would not have happened. And the sanctions should be imposed against the persons who are involved. There are specific names who are the heads of the militaristic youth movements. There are names of the persons who were the directors of the camps for education of our citizens, and those camps, by their program, they are aimed at eradication of Ukrainian identity, they're aimed at indoctrination, they're aimed at cultural genocide, and they should be put under sanctions too. So we should qualify this as genocide, because in convention the definition of genocide includes the transition of children from one group to another, because in my opinion it shouldn't be treated solely as physical transition, because what Russian Federation does in the occupied territories through education is the transition from one group to another. It's the eradication, reformatting, and creation of Russian identity in our children, and there should be a serious discussion in the international level about this, and not looking away and demonstrating concern to see how Ukraine deals with the occupation. This is why we have to start talking about this in international level. Why I'm saying about international level? Because fortunately there is understanding on the Ukrainian level already. Our prosecutor's office works in this area. They add materials to the cases. The investigation is being promoted to bring those people to liability, and we need international support, because it's wrong when on the international level we only say about the most obvious crimes, the most horrific crimes, and we don't notice other crimes which are like less horrific in this very moment, but which have a long-term effect. If torturing is, say, more horrific and more terrifying in this very moment, but what is being done to our children there in the long-term perspective, it will have incredibly horrific effect on those children and on us as the society. And unfortunately we're seeing this influence now already, because the children who were experiencing militarization, they are being recruited to the armed forces of Russian Federation, and we don't know the number of the children who are currently in the ranks of the Russian armed forces fighting against us. And the horror is that those children, they die now. They were affected by propaganda, and part of them unfortunately believed in that propaganda, and another part is resistant, but we're not talking about that resistance. We don't want to notice it. But imagine, for the 9 years, for example, you were 10 at the moment of occupation, and now you're 19, and since you were 10, you were told about Russian Federation, how it is a savior, how it protects the whole world against fascists and Nazis, and you believe in it, and if you don't, you're a hero. Like in the school, you act like if you trust your teachers, and then you come back home and you communicate to your parents in a different way, and we have to incredibly value the children who preserved the Ukrainian identity, who found the inner force to remain Ukrainian. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions on the floor, please take the microphone. Sergei Kovalsky, head of civil organization, Crimean Center of Business and Cultural Cooperation, Ukrainian House. You mentioned in the presentation that the problem of eradication of Ukrainian identity is not a problem that started in 2014. It was started like 100 years ago, and I would like to hear a little bit about the condition of Ukrainian community, about the Ukrainian education during the years of independence. What were the mistakes? And because what Russia does within the last 9 years is more or less clear to us, but what should we do further on? What should the Ukrainian state do after the liberation? How to treat the Ukrainian community? How to treat Ukrainians, Ukrainian children, to make Crimea Ukrainian and not otherwise? Well, it's a fundamental question. It deserves another full-scale briefing. Well, before answering the question, I would like to compliment to the very emotional speech by Ms. Maria. Us as the expert group, in the beginning of February, we officially applied to UNESCO. You know that UNESCO has two priority areas of work is the education and cultural heritage. We submitted a request for the Russians to be excluded from UNESCO, and no matter how many meetings we have, no matter how many reports we submit, unfortunately there are no resolutions that we expect. Those should be the responses of international community. So our group, we documented, we submitted those documents. We were the first to make such reports out of all the expert networks. We translated our report into English language. We submitted it through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and we handed it to the UNESCO mission, which was in Ukraine back then. We handed it publicly. And another component for today is, yes, we have a question of sanctions, criminal proceedings that should be formatted in criminal code, and we should talk about ethnocide and linguicide. It's already the documented fact. There should be no criminal proceedings. About collaboration, it's one thing which is quite clear, but there are matters when the Ukrainian identity is being consistently eradicated. If we have to work it through legislative act, we should do it. It's important. It's not about collaboration or something like that today. It's the eradication of Ukrainian identity and killing of Ukrainian language. In response to Sergei's question, what should we do? We have to get prepared. We had to train the personnel. I would like to see the personnel reserve that is being discussed by the government officials, and who would be responsible in that staff for education. And that would be a person to address those issues, and it should be done today already. Well, it should have been done yesterday, actually. As Council of Ukrainians of Crimea, we applied to the President of Ukraine. Why don't we have a Crimean military administrations? There are military administrations in all the regions of Ukraine, but in Crimea there is none. And it's a shame, because there should be an education department in the military administrations, which would have helped us to solve very critical issues like monitoring, analysis, and we would create the sanction lists and packages, and we have such experience thanks to the work of our organization. There are sanction packages and criminal investigations, a lot of them submitted through the prosecutor's office of the Republic of Crimea. And we should continue doing this. And could you please remind me what was the other part of your question? Do we correctly understand that the Ukrainian community is the mostly discriminated community in Crimea? And what should the government do to make Crimea Ukrainian? Well, the questions of personnel reserve, I already responded it. So about the most discriminated Ukrainian community, yes, it is so, because Ukrainian community cannot afford to demonstrate their flag or to speak their language. Well, I gave you yesterday's experience when Galina Balaban, the representative of Ukrainian Cultural Center, was arrested. So Ukrainian community ended up in a very difficult conditions, and that study, that report focuses on what is going on today, what we will see within the first days after the occupations, what we will feel. So from 24% 24% census back in 2001, it was reduced to 7% now. So it's the genocide of Ukrainians in Crimea. Maria, Anastasia, if Anastasia wants to join us. Anastasia, are you with us? If you have anything to add, I would like to add something to the first part to your question as to the policies of Russian Federations in identity of Ukrainian identity. Within our coalition of Ukrainians 5 o'clock, we published an article where we referred the report of Rafal Lemkev, who back in the 40s of the last year was talking about the genocide of Ukrainians by Soviet Union in international platform, and it was translated into Ukrainian, and he described the tendencies very similar to those of today. And regarding the policies after the occupation of Crimea, the occupation of Ukrainian occupied territories, is a very complex matter, and the government should approach it in a complex manner to develop the policy for integration of Ukrainian children. And it's so complicated and sensitive, and it should involve teachers, psychologists, human rights protection activists. It should be all done in compliance with international standards and with account of the best interests of the children. And as Maria said, we should focus on the fact that they are Ukrainian citizens who were living under occupation for 9 years. They were living under very serious ideological pressure, and unfortunately, as a lawyer, as an analyst, I cannot give you specific answer other than we should approach it in a very sensitive and a complex manner, and with account of the best interests of Ukrainian children who unfortunately were living so long under Russian occupation. And if I may, a short remark about what Andrii said about the personnel reserve. We support this idea. This personnel should be trained how to work with those kids. We should develop methodic recommendations today. There should be training classes for those teachers now, so that they could reintegrate those children, and it should be done today. And it's like, you know, every year we know it would snow, but our utility services are never ready for snowing. So in this case, when we deoccupy our lands, we should know what to do. I think we had more questions on the floor. Well, no, we don't. Well, I want to thank you. I see that the occupiers know how to do what they do. They launch all the processes related to education immediately. We've seen those instances in 2022 during the occupation of our territories, and we should know how to work with this. We should learn how to work with this. The last example yesterday, maybe you've seen yesterday's conversation of the Commissioner for Children's Rights with Putin when they discussed the adoption of a child from Mariupol. Don't you think that such a public event is aimed at legitimization of such process, not like long term of re-identification of our children, but physical transition, the stealing, kidnapping of our children? Unfortunately, I haven't seen that conversation yesterday, but the actions of Maria Lvova Belova, they are beyond reasonable, because she's a bright figure who propagates the relocation of our children, who takes pride in the fact that they kidnap our children, they re-educate them, they give them away for adoption by Russian families. She had some public addresses before, and where she said that she had some articles before, and they said that after 2 to 3 months the children don't say any bad words against Putin, and they stand up when they hear the Russian anthem playing. And I know that Maria Lvova Belova was on the list on the criminal proceedings submitted by Ukraine to the international courts, and is the result of the fact that the international society is not ready to talk about the genocide when it's already happening. And the important moment is that Russia was adopting our kids since 2014. They were taking our children away from Crimea with this train of hope. They were taking away our kids from Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and only now, when the scale of this movement became so obvious, everybody started talking about this on international level. And this is about what I've said. We have to be loud in order not to let those violations to happen again, and to the bigger scale. I know that there is a serious war going on in the international level to develop the strategy, the plan of actions, how to bring our children back, how to pull them out of Russian Federation. And the help of our partners is invaluable, and it's very important, because without the support of our partners we won't be physically able to pull them out of Russia, because the more they stay there, the more the influence on their conscience, and the sooner we get them out of there, the easier for us to work with their psychological trauma which they received due to the fact of their relocation and kidnapping. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for this conversation. Joining us was Anastasia Vorobyova, Maria Sulyalina, and Andrii Shchekun. Thank you very much for this important subject that you brought up. We have to make it loud. We have to make it heard all around the world. Thank you very much. And we continue working on our victory, trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.